precious people who are joining us. But welcome to everyone who is here today. We have put together a very exciting program, and I would like to thank our speakers for giving up their time today to put this on. I would also like to acknowledge the Parliament the federal member for that Engai, and thank you for your presence today. I think it certainly aligns, I know, with your interest areas, and we really appreciate your advocacy for areas of carbon and carbon farming. So thank you. I would also just like to acknowledge two of the North East CMA board members who are in attendance today, so Maureen Rogers and Lynn Gowan, and just extend apologies from the board chair, Dr. Christine Cunningham. She would like to have been here, but she can't. Just very quickly, before I give a bit of an overview and formally introduce today's program, I would like to just go through a few housekeeping rules. So first of all, we all have these in our pockets. Please just do a double check that they are on silent, or even better, off, so that we know that your attention is with us today. I know that's sometimes a real luxury, isn't it? Just to be able to focus on something and not be checking messages. In terms of our emergency escape routes, if there needs to be, so we have doors to the side here and also at the front, and the emergency gathering point is actually just on the hill here. So straight up these doors and onto the hill. We have a number of NECMA and partner staff here today to help you if need be. They are wearing high vis. You probably saw lots of it. We also have trained first aiders here as well, if you need that as well. We do understand that there's still nervousness around COVID, so there are masks at the front desk if you feel that you would like one. There's sanitizer as well, and of course, if anyone starts to feel unwell, please, the best place for you is to go home or back to your accommodation. I think that's all the housekeeping. Toilets. Toilets are straight through this door into that hallway and on the right. So that's the housekeeping out of the way. For the last 5 years, the North East Catchment Management Authority, with support from the Australian Government, has been working with a number of partners, including Agriculture Victoria, Landcare and Murray Dairy, on 2 projects that have been closely related in terms of looking at the importance of our soils and our soils to sustainable and productive agriculture, and also climate change. And how do we as a region think about adaptation to climate change? Since the start of those 2 projects, nearly 5 years ago now, the rise of the interest in carbon and the role carbon plays in our businesses, both from an agricultural perspective, so land managers, farmers, but also throughout the supply chain, has only grown. And so it's amazing to see such a wonderful room of diverse people here today wanting to find out more about this really important topic. We've managed to pull together a really exciting program of people that are going to provide you both with technical but also practical insights into carbon and what it means for your business potentially. Now, hands up those of you that listen to ABC radio. All right, so you know when they do the finance section, and at the start of that, they always say, we're about to give you some advice that's general in nature. It's up to you to work out how this applies to your situation. And when I was looking through this program, I thought, that's exactly the same here. There's a whole lot of information out there around carbon, what it means for our business, how do we understand the carbon equation of our business? You know, the carbon that we are emitting versus the carbon that we are storing. And what that looks like for all of our businesses, no matter where we are in the supply chain, will be a bit different. So hopefully this program today gives you enough that you can say, oh, that's of relevance, or that's something of interest, and then think about how to explore that further to make it relevant to your business. But also to connect with the ideas and the people and the great brain power within this room to actually make sense of it in your context. And that's really, what is so important at this time when there is so much information out there, so many people involved. How do we make sense of the information out there? So hopefully by bringing together this trusted panel, you can start to understand that better and apply it to your business. We would encourage everyone at the breaks today to engage in conversations around this information, to think about and to tease out some of those subjects and what does it mean for me, or what does it mean for the supply chain that we're in. We know that consumers and industry are looking at this in increasing detail and wanting to understand where it sits within the supply chains that they're accessing. So its importance is only going to increase into the future. So over to our speakers and to you to make the most out of this opportunity. I will invite Dr. Helen Hayes to the lectern to just follow up with a few opening remarks. So thank you.
I think we're good. Great. Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to the North East Catchment Management Authority. I recognise the board members here with us today, Ming McGowan and Maureen Rogers. Also add my voice to Katie's acknowledgement of our First Nations Australians, and just to add to that this year we will be having a referendum whereby we have the opportunity as a nation to constitutionally enshrine a voice to Parliament. And I encourage you to have a yarn about that and to maybe even make contact with me if you feel the desire to. I'd love you to, as we look towards that opportunity, which will probably come to us around October, for something that will be nation building, I think, for Australia. So, farming, carbon is a hot topic. Katie's just highlighted that. It's an important topic, and when I return to Parliament next week, we'll be debating the government's Safeguard Mechanism bill. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that. It's getting a lot of play on the radio and on the Insiders program on a Sunday morning and across the airwaves more broadly. And this bill is about reducing emissions for our biggest national emitters. And one of the key ways the bill will do this is by those big emitting companies buying credits, known as Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs is the term we're hearing a lot. And they're purchasing those ACCUs with the intent of offsetting emissions. Now, if this bill passes, and it's being hotly debated, it's likely that the demand for ACCUs will absolutely increase. And that's where carbon farming, we'll call it farming carbon, I can't quite get my tongue around, carbon farming comes in. And we know that farmers can earn credits through some specific land management practices which increase and sustain carbon in soils. We know that there's an opportunity to improve significant remnant native vegetation on our properties, or indeed to reduce methane through herd management, to name just a few practices. And I'm fully aware that soil carbon farming presents many, many questions. And that's why we're here today, to explore those questions and to explore them with a context-specific lens. And we need to do that, particularly in the electorate of Indi, where we have a higher rainfall zone than the average, meaning that we have really good existing soil carbon levels. I'm also hearing that there are serious concerns from researchers and scientists about the integrity of carbon credits, and we must approach our offsets with caution and explore the integrity. Nevertheless, it's important to understand what carbon farming means for our pathway towards a low emissions economy and what's possible for farmers to take up the opportunities, but ultimately to work with the science to increase our agricultural productivity. And today's conference is a timely opportunity to hear from some of Australia's foremost researchers and practitioners on these exact questions. How absolutely perfect to be having this conference here today. How can we ensure that our farmers stay competitive with the transition to a low emissions economy? How do our policies and practices need to evolve to optimise value for our farmers and our soils? What are the economic and practical implications for carbon farming in Indi? In the agricultural sector, should we be aiming for climate neutral rather than carbon neutral farming practices? These are some of the questions that I know you'll be exploring today. And they're complicated questions. There is no silver bullet or simple answer. Again, it's why this conference is so timely. It's also why, in the lead up to the May federal budget, I'm advocating to the government to fund a network of 200 agricultural extension officers right around regional Australia. Extension officers who can work with farmers on a one-to-one basis to adopt the technology, the products and farming practices that would help them lower their emissions, access carbon credits and achieve net zero. It could also help them access other government programs like the nature repair market that will generate biodiversity credits. The government could then certify those farms as carbon or climate neutral, which could open opportunities to price premiums for their products and protect their access to overseas markets. And I'm doing this because I consistently hear from people like you, people in our agricultural sector, that that's the kind of support we need on the ground. Our farmers currently generate 16% of Australia's emissions, and we know that the government has agreed to net zero by 2050. And right now, countries right around the world, like the European Union, are considering tariffs on Australian agricultural imports. So we need to consider this incredibly seriously. When I talk to farmers across Indi, I hear a consistent message from them that they wish to adopt practices that help them adjust to a changing climate. They want to mitigate the impact of climate change, and they want to play their part in reducing emissions and diversify their income through participation in the carbon market. But the pathway to achieving that is far from clear. And what they've consistently told me is that in historical moments of practice change in agriculture, what has helped farmers is assistance in the translation of science into practice through agricultural extension. An agricultural extension officer program could provide this help. And so I've been speaking with the Minister for Agriculture, Murray Watt, about this policy, and indeed to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, and I've written to the Minister for Environment as well. And I know that there's an appetite out there from the Australian government to take this on. And in fact, Minister Watt tells me that in the short time since this new government has come to power, that he's hearing this more and more. He was the first person I went to see, the first minister I spoke to when the new government was formed, and I talked to him about this call for support of extension officers. And we need to do this because we need to help our farmers protect their access to world markets, support them to lower emissions, certify products as zero carbon, and improve biodiversity on the land. And irrespective of what this means in terms of the carbon market, we know that it ultimately improves our productivity. So I hear from farmers about the need for carbon farming to consider benefits beyond emissions reductions, things like minimising soil erosion, increasing water retention, and improving biodiversity through ecosystem management. It's not just about our farmers making an extra buck on a new market, it's about driving good agricultural systems in a changing climate, because that in itself will increase productivity. So a holistic approach to land management is crucial. A team of trusted, known, neutral agricultural extension officers would help farmers navigate and negotiate the complex terrain that is carbon and biodiversity markets. And these officers would need to be locally based, context specific, to know the land, to know the environment and the climate of the farms they're supporting. Emissions reduction or carbon farming in the Mallee looks very different to carbon farming in Indi, and any officer would have to have context-specific knowledge. I grew up on a dairy farm, and together with my husband Phil, we still raise a few cattle today, and I know that extension is a critical piece of the agricultural world. And given that net zero transition is a huge challenge for how we practice agriculture in this country, we need to back our farmers with the right support. So today I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the important research in this field, to hear from industry experts around our markets, and to get an understanding of what's on your mind. I really encourage you at the conclusion of this conference, or any time actually, to get in touch with my office in the areas that you think you need advocacy to the Australian federal government on. I am your representative. I want to do that work for you on the federal page, so please come to me with that. I wish you all a great day, great success in your deliberations. I'm looking forward to hearing the panel conversation. That's where colour really comes into the room, when the questions fly and the answers are explored. So thank you for the invitation today, and my very best wishes.
Thank you, Helen. So we will have a panel after our speakers this morning. So in your program, there's a section at the back for you to write notes. So if you do have questions that come up during the presentation, I just ask you to jot them down, and then when we have the panel up, we can go through those questions. So our first speaker today is Alexander Garton, and as Chair of the Victorian Agriculture and Climate Change Council, and plus with your very impressive CV of directorships and experience across a range of industries, I can think of no one better to give us an opening view of the big things in climate change. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thanks for that introduction, Thomas. Yes, keep on. Now, I did say to Richard Eckhart was on the program a bit later, but there's two photos of him here, so you may see him. But thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It is quite an honour to share some insights and talk with you. I'm really by no means an expert, so I just need to put that out there. There are some real specialists in the room, and I'm a generalist. I try to put things together. But what I do hope to achieve this morning is to share a few of the big picture stats and drivers, and to leave you with some curiosity and hopefully even a little bit of clarity as to this world of agriculture and climate change. A number of the experts will touch on topics in depth that I'll briefly skim over in this introduction scene setting. But as Katie said, make yourselves a list of questions and new thoughts that you really want to explore today or in the following months. So let's get started at a global level. So greenhouse gas emissions are fundamental to the biological processes that underpin food and fibre production. So we can't just wipe them out. We actually, to produce food, to produce fibre, we will be emitting greenhouse gas emissions. But since the 1990s, these global emissions attributed to agriculture have continued to increase. And this graph here highlights, on a per capita basis, this is not total emissions, Australia's global ranking. And we're the third column from your left. And the maroon colour at the bottom of this chart is agriculture, and highlights the contribution that agriculture as part of these emissions makes in Australia and a few neighbouring countries. You can see Brazil has quite a high quantum of the emissions directly from agriculture, but Australia is up there in the top dozen. In 2020, global agricultural emissions from agriculture accounted for 16.2% of global emissions, as Helen said. But really, if we're taking the entire food and fibre value chain, a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions result from the agricultural and processing sector. So we really do need to identify and then remove any unnecessary emissions from agriculture so we can lean into this global action to address human-induced climate change. So from global to Australia, in the year to December 21, agriculture accounted for 15.8% of Australia's national emissions. So emissions from agriculture include methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So methane and nitrous oxide are estimated from enteric fermentation and manure management in livestock. Emissions are also estimated for the release of nitrous oxide from cropping and pasture land, often related to fertiliser use, crop residue and animal waste. And emissions are also estimated from burning of agricultural residues, so burning our stubble. So just to clarify, in a lot of these accounts, emissions associated with the use of electricity, fuel consumption to operate equipment and transport are accounted for in the energy sector, not ag. And so carbon sequestration associated with tree planting and vegetation or agroforestry are accounted for in the land use change and forestry sector, the LULUCF, which is the one on the far right. So the most important sectoral drivers for Australia's long-term emissions trend have actually been, firstly, electricity, which is the red dotted line you can see here, where after decades of strong growth, emissions peaked in 2009 and have since fallen about 24.2%. And this generally reflects accelerating renewables deployment and gradual displacement of coal as a fuel source. Now, stationary energy, which excludes electricity, and it's things like fossil fuels, gas and coal, used in electricity generation and in the direct production of industrial heat, as well as geothermal energy. That's showing the largest growth of any sector in percentage terms since 1990. That's the black line here. Emissions have increased 53.6% in particular by recent growth in the export of liquid natural gas. Transport, where emissions have increased 48% since 1990, despite recent volatility due to COVID, which really meant that we didn't travel too far. Fugitives, which is not some SP out of a prism, are those losses, leaks and other releases of gases like methane and carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that are associated with industries producing natural gas, oil and coal. Can also be emissions from our own fridges in our households. And these emissions were relatively stable until 2012, but have increased strongly as a result of LNG industry. Now, agriculture, which is the blue line with the dots, emissions declined by 15.8% since 1990, in line with the declining cattle and sheep populations. And finally, land use change in forestry, which is a bit of a lump for everything, is where emissions have decreased by the largest margin of any sector since 1990. They've reduced by 120.3%. And that's really due to reductions in land clearing, native forest harvesting reductions, and increases in plantations and native vegetation, and improvements in soil cover. So emissions from agriculture increased 4.2% in actual terms just over 2021, which is the latest data available. The next lot of data will be out next month. The drought conditions continued to ease at the end of 2021, and that's been leading to herd and flock rebuilding, but really livestock population numbers are yet to fully recover to previous levels. So there's been some rebound in crop production. Those of you who are cropping should have had a reasonable year if you didn't get too wet, and particularly rice because water was available. So let's narrow things down further to the state of Victoria, and I do acknowledge that state borders really are merely lines on maps, and many of you will be operating across these lines. So Victoria contributes about 17% to national emissions. So in 2020, Victoria was the third largest contributor to Australia's total net emissions, with 16.7%, behind Queensland with 32% and New South Wales with 26.6%. 16.7% was actually Victoria's lowest emissions on record. And much of this was due to COVID restrictions, which have delivered quite a savings for emissions across the state. But it has been a good decline. Now, the electricity sector is responsible for almost 2/3 of the reduction in Victoria's total net emissions between 2005 and 2020. And transport emissions increased steadily with population growth from 2005, contributing about a quarter to 25% of Victoria's net emissions in 2020. And with road transport really responsible for most of the sector's emissions, pandemic-related reductions in transport and human movement saw this decrease for the first time in 2020 since 1990. The IPPU, which is one of the ones above the line, It's really releases from industrial processes that chemically or physically transform materials. So blast furnaces in the iron and steel industry, ammonia and other chemical products manufactured from fossil fuels used as chemical feedstocks. This actually also increased between 2005 and 2020, driven mainly by the growth in the stock of air conditioning and refrigeration systems. So all about us wanting to have cool houses and appropriate refrigeration. Victoria's forests and natural systems absorbed over a quarter of Victoria's emissions in 2020, the yellow one on the right-hand side. Forest land, remaining forest land, was the largest contributor to emissions reduction in Victoria despite the summer bushfires of 2019. And those burnt over 1.5 million hectares of land, as you know. But the emissions from those bushfires will actually be spread across a number of years because of the way forests regenerate after bushfires and also internationally agreed carbon accounting rules for extreme bushfires. So the agriculture sector was actually the main source of methane emissions, predominantly from livestock digestive processes. There are also smaller contributions to methane emissions from waste, mainly solid waste disposal, and fugitive emissions, essentially from the distribution of natural gas sectors. But agriculture is also the main source of nitrous oxide emissions, which arise from agricultural soils due to microbial and chemical transformations associated with nitrogen fertiliser application. So there are certain gases as part of our greenhouse gas emissions that our sector is directly responsible for and the primary producer of. In 2020, the energy sector remained the largest contributor to Victoria's emissions, with the majority of emissions coming from that electricity subsector, followed by transport and fuel combustion. But beyond the energy sector, the next highest contributor to Victorian emissions was agriculture, contributing 19.3% of net emissions in 2020. So our sector is the fourth largest emitter in Victoria. Now, as in other sectors are getting a lot of focus and attention to try and reduce their emissions. They're in media, they're getting a lot of focus from the political space, they're getting a lot of focus from regulators. And so with that focus generally comes investment to reduce their emissions. So we're likely to see agriculture move on the medal podium. So we'll move from fourth to third as those sectors really focus on reducing their emissions. And I don't think that that's a medal podium position that we actually want to hold. Now, Victoria's agricultural emissions fluctuated significantly between 1990 and 2020, driven mainly by seasonal conditions and by domestic food demand and exports. Now, enteric fermentation has been responsible for the largest share, and that's the yellow on this bar graph. And that's declined from 79.2% in 1990 to 68.6% in 2020, which is really a pretty solid reduction, but much of that's been as a result of declining herd numbers. The share of other subcategories has increased over that same period, including from agricultural soils, so that went from 12.8% to 17.7%. That's a good stat. Nice dropping. Manure management went from 6.9% to 9.1%, and urea application from 0.3% to 2.4% of our emissions. So really, as we've ramped up land mass under production and as we've ramped up the intensity of production, those emissions have increased. Now, reduced enteric fermentation emissions from sheep grazing was the main contributor to the 5.4% decline in agricultural sector emissions. Primarily, like I said, due to the sheep population since 1990. Emissions from cattle were higher in 2020 compared to 1990, but interannual fluctuations occurred throughout the period, so that really reflects that variation in cattle numbers. And as the sector increases production levels, we will see emissions increase without intervention. So this shows the four subcategories with the greatest contribution, agricultural subcategories to emissions from agriculture. Emissions from enteric fermentation decreased by 18% between 1990 and 2020 due to the factors I've just talked about, cattle and sheep. But the other three sub-themes, so manure management, ag soils and urea application increased over that same time. But no clear trend has emerged in manure management emissions, which vary depending on livestock numbers, our management strategies and climate factors. So emissions from ag soils grew by 4.9%, and an expansion of the total area of crop production is certainly a factor, particularly for wheat, barley and canola. You would have seen that just driving around the country. And the associated increases in the application of nitrogen fertilisers, crop residue and animal wastes really was assumed responsible for this growth. So the application of fertiliser increased from just under 50,000 to 328,000 tonnes of nitrogen. It's a 561% increase. Which is why really thinking about our fertiliser application is absolutely crucial, not just for your big profit, but for our emissions. It also contributed to a significant increase in urea application emissions, which grew sevenfold between 1990 and 2020, with particularly strong growth in the last decade. So this increase in fertiliser application aligns with the increased production that we've seen. We've seen the Grains Research and Development Corporation really see increased volumes of grain and the levies being paid. But it's not all bad, this increased production. So a highly efficient farming system has a lower emissions intensity. So if we're getting as much efficient production as possible for the emissions produced, we're maximising the return for our greenhouse gas profile. So we need to produce more food to feed a growing global population. We need to ensure we're really productively efficient, to be maximising for every CO2 equivalent produced from our business. Now let's step back a bit, shake the head to get all of those graphs into place and look at a simple snapshot of the type of agricultural emissions, their proportions and where they come from. So what I'd like you to do is think about how you are or how you might measure emissions. Who might you hear from today that can help you to improve your measurement or start measuring your emissions? How might you adapt practices? And what mitigation actions you might take to reduce emissions while increasing your productivity. We've got to be making sure we keep our eye on productivity and profitability in order to really drive emissions down. Net zero is really, really hard. Climate smart is very achievable. And addressing your carbon intensity and being climate smart are definitely possible. For those of you in the room running farm businesses, you'll be innately aware of the on-farm drivers that influence your productivity and profitability. Size, operational efficiency, skill and labour, financial capacity and capital. Many of you in the room will also be comfortable with a range of external drivers. Seasonal conditions, technology and practice, government policy, market conditions and infrastructure. But increasing influence is going to come from corporate agribusiness, with market and supply chain expectations changing with direct implications for farmers. So being prepared with good understanding and good data is going to help. The supply chains are committing to net zero emissions in 2050, which may have flow-on effects, and entities like Coles, Woolworths, Metcash, Aldi, JPS, Fonterra, Saputo, and many, many more are committing to climate action and wider ESG action, environmental, social governance action. And you'll hear more from a number of corporates through the speakers today. But let me flag a couple of areas. So environmental, social and governance, ESG, metrics enable a shareholder of a company to understand how the company manages its environmental assets, its people assets, and the policy and governance culture. And they provide indicators for how sustainable its operations are and if the performance trends of that company will continue. So any investors and shareholders are looking at ESG metrics along with the financial performance of the business. For the majority of companies, the majority of their environmental impact does not actually happen in their factory or direct operations. It comes through their supply chain, which involves you. Most companies are now considering ESG metrics in their procurement actions and looking for pain points along the value chain to focus their efforts on. They do this because shareholders are demanding ESG metrics in the reporting that companies do to stock exchanges and determining whether or not they invest in those companies. So directors of companies and management of companies are actually listening to what those shareholders want. For farmers, this means being able to share data on the farm business ESG impact, and it's becoming an important factor of being a trusted and valued supplier. Those of you who are currently supplying coals would be aware of some of the questions and data they're asking from you, along with other corporate agribusiness. So data on carbon emissions, which is a current focus, water quality and quantity, farm biodiversity, animal welfare, working conditions, farm labour policies, worker health and safety, and even the farm business decision-making structures are all part of the ESG mix. And whilst this can sound daunting because we've moved from carbon to now talking ESG, the types of data a farm business may be asked for is often that which you are already collecting or likely to capture if you're continually striving for that greater productivity and strengthening of your business viability. If your business is connected to a supply chain that's working towards clearly communicated ESG targets, it's likely you'll be asked to provide data. And it's not a bad outcome because data really does help us make better decisions and strengthen our operations. But there are some concerns I've got with how companies are seeking data from farmers and how they may in the future. Because you could get asked by any of the corporate agribusinesses that you work with to provide data in different formats for them. So really the Australian agricultural industry and government need to be working together to ensure that there is one set of data that farmers supply to corporate agribusiness to meet their ESG reporting obligations. So investors and consumers want to support companies that take the ideas of environmental sustainability, community engagement and workers' rights seriously. And that whilst there's a fair bit of lip service across corporate Australia, there are steps being taken. So some of you, got a couple of these images up here on the screen now. In Europe, most of the progressive action on climate change and ESG reporting is taking place. Companies are having to report on their Scope 3 emissions, so not only what they produce themselves, but what their customers are producing in carbon emissions is having to be reported if they're listed on the European Stock Exchange, which means they need to know from farmers and other businesses what their carbon emissions are. Also, banks in Europe are having to report on the Scope 3 emissions of their customers to be able to continue to operate and get regulator support. And we know in Australia, the Australian banking regulator is also requiring banks to start reporting on Scope 3 emissions of their customers. So if your bank isn't starting to talk to you about your carbon emissions and your other environmental and social metrics on your farm, they will. The first tranche of capital has come in via Rabobank from Europe, and it's green capital, which means they want to see an obligation they have is to ensure that farms that they give that capital to are meeting environmental social governance obligations so that those investors that provided that capital have faith that they're investing in those sustainability outcomes. So that will start to come across a number of banks. Most companies are reporting on their climate action in line with the International Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And companies are having to buy, as Helen said, carbon units to offset their own emissions. I would caution any farmer from selling your carbon just yet. Unless you know what emissions you are producing and whether or not you are carbon neutral or carbon smart on your farm, I would not be selling for the risk of selling off something you might need to offset your own emissions in the future, or selling before you know the true value and locking yourself into a long-term contract. So hasten really slowly when it comes to, once you know what your emissions profile is and you know what carbon you might be capturing on your property through your revegetation activities and changed animal management practices, hold off on selling too quickly. There's a lot at play, and as Helen said, there's still policy frameworks being developed. There are lots of areas companies can acquire their carbon offsets through various reforestation, renewable energy and energy efficient investments, and wait until they're offering more money. Wait until you know if you need those carbon units to offset your own business activities, which we call insetting, before you get too active in the carbon market. Take that with a grain of salt, as Katie said. Consider my reflections and take your own actions. In Europe, investors are taking the directors of shell companies to court individually for their failure to act on climate action. So increasingly, we will see really savvy, sustainable, climate-focused investors ensure that the directors of companies are truly doing their bit. And that includes understanding their entire emissions profile from their customers through to their own operations and genuinely taking action. There's also the evolving task force for nature-based financial disclosures coming into play. So just like carbon and climate action is now a global reporting requirement for listed companies, so too will be their actions when it comes to biodiversity. So they will be asking farmers about biodiversity metrics and what you're doing to support and sustain biodiversity on farm. In Europe, Mondelez is actually signalling that they will only take grain that guarantee it's not being grown with certain chemicals, glyphosate being one of those. So they are now targeting very environmentally conscious consumers to say this biscuit has been produced without any of the chemicals that harm bees or the chemical that everyone talks about, from glyphosate. So we have to be thinking in our farming systems, what does this mean? So let's talk a little bit about government. Now, you will get this slide deck, so there's a lot of detail in here that I'd like you to read about later. So here are a couple of the programs taking place in countries around the world. In the Netherlands, they're reducing their herd by 30% to address methane emissions. In Ireland, they're actually putting in place a program that sets sustainability targets across the entire industry, and it's got private and public sector partnerships. Wales, Canada, New Zealand, and you would have heard about the birth tax in New Zealand. Well, all of that started with really strong collaboration in designing what programs will support the agricultural industry, understanding its emissions profile and then taking action. In Australia, the Commonwealth and states are implementing programs. Now, the Commonwealth is catching up now, but they're catching up from a start line that was way back. So the Climate Change Act 2022 has set a 43% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And the Australian government joined the Global Methane Pledge just last year, agreeing to reduce global methane by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. And there are a number of key programs, so Sustainable Seaweed Alliance, Methane Emissions Reduction, Carbon Farming Outreach Program, to name a few. So, Victoria. The Victorian Government is committed to protecting and enhancing the future of our sector, the ag sector, by ensuring it is well placed to reduce emissions, prepare for climate risk and take advantage of the opportunities. So there's a framework outlined here that highlights how they're setting some emissions reduction targets, sector pledges, and then implementing action. Now, the Ag Sector Pledge has been developed to deliver some long-term shared vision, some trials of leading research and tools and services to help farmers to reduce emissions. And you'll hear some of those services from people like Alison and Sam later today, and you'll also hear from Richard around some of the research. So the pledge has 4 components that you can access here in Victoria. And in 2022, some of the key deliverables included a statement that was really developed across industry and government to set this shared vision with really ambitious action on climate change. Over 90 stakeholders and 45 organisations contributed to developing this statement and shaping that way forward. But the pledge is also delivering key research findings that will support Victorian farmers to reduce their emissions. So in early 2023, the research team concluded their first experiments with 2 formulations of seaweed, asparagus, in the dairy grazing systems. So for these experiments, the product was fed twice daily using pulse feeding techniques during each milking, and methane production was reduced from 39%, that was reduced between 39% and 44% with no significant effect on milk yield. So future research is going to test different products and formulations for dairy and grazing, and test them in different environments. The challenge is to ensure that the research is commercial, because at the moment, with $1.48 per head to feed seaweed, it's just not economic. So great research, but we're a bit of the way off. There's a range of emissions reduction programs. Again, when you get this slide deck, have a look through and see which of these programs you're aware of or you'd like to access, and talk to some of the CMA contacts and others. So you're feeling a little bit uncertain. You're here because you're trying to get a little bit of clarity. That's okay. Uncertainty is really a major constraint in decision making. So it either results in paralysis and conservatism, so we actually go to extreme risk taking and don't want to do too much. On the other hand, in the face of uncertainty, we make desperate decisions and actions, or you might say, well, they love taking risks. And uncertainty reduces the likelihood that we're able to really identify the optimal strategy for handling the situation before it eventuates. So climate change, the uncertainty of that, how we respond to decision making, is an absolute challenge for determining the best course of action for the agriculture industry and your individual farm business. And a major cause of that uncertainty is complexity. Now, ag is complex, and the climate change space across agriculture is also complex. The largest source of agricultural emissions, methane from livestock in pasture-based systems, does not yet have a commercially available solution and needs specific action. So there's a potential solution, but it's not attainable in a real-world commercial farm business yet. With 21,600 farm businesses operating across Victoria, the success of technical solutions and practices required needs really sustained adoption, which requires extension support, as Helen said, and behaviour change on a really broad scale. And reducing ag emissions is actually quite complex. Farm business managers and ag business professionals may have limited resources, skills or capacity. So what we're doing today is addressing our knowledge and capacity. And climate action messages and advice across government is often misaligned and mismatched, and it's a really busy and fragmented policy space. So what you might hear from a catchment management authority might be different to a land care group, might be different to an ag department, might be different to a farming systems group. And that is not helpful. So really, we can help to clarify and align messages ourselves. So, second last slide, where might you sit on this wheel? Either as a farmer or someone working with farmers. And some of this, low participation, uncertainty and confusion, limited understanding, unsure of our role, conditions really complex. You'd be ticking quite a few of these boxes, as I do when I look at the climate change and agriculture space. But I'm aiming to build out and to try and reduce the level of complexity, to increase my understanding in these spaces. And what do we need to do that? It's about listening, which is what you're here today, and having conversations, asking questions and listening to the response. Consider what is shared and understand the implications for your business. And then my advice is hasten slowly. This is an evolving space. The policy environment is still to settle. There will be key drivers that will influence how quickly you need to act, and some of that will come from the corporate space, some might come from the government space, some might come from peers. Don't sell what you don't yet measure or deeply understand. In other words, do not sell your carbon too early. Understand what you might need to use it to offset your own emissions first. And Richard might talk about some farm business emissions profiles and the importance of insetting some of those emissions that really, we produce food and fibre. It does emit greenhouse gases. So we're going to have to try and have our own inset into carbon to be able to have a neutrality. Know your numbers. So if you don't yet know what your emissions profile might be, explore how you can get your head around that. Because most of you know your production metrics to the decimal place, I hope. And your bankers hope as well, I'm sure. So you need to start measuring and really understanding your environmental and social metrics. So carbon is the first step. Biodiversity and your workforce metrics will be important as companies start to ask for more data around environmental, social, governance metrics that they need to report to their investors. So you need to be thinking about your carbon, your emissions intensity. The better and more productive and efficient your system is, the better the emissions intensity number. Your biodiversity metrics, your workforce safety and wellbeing. These are all things to start thinking about. Don't do them all at once, but be aware that you need to start capturing data and understanding where you sit. Think about what tools are available to your industry or business to measure and capture your data. What climate actions suit your business, and adaptation actions will help get your muscles and your brain thinking in the right way so that you can then undertake mitigation actions. Because not all mitigation actions are yet commercially viable. So practice putting in place adaptation practices on farm so that you are ready when those commercial solutions are available. Then be thinking about what resources you need to implement these. Do you need more time? Do you need capital? Do you need the skills and knowledge? And what benefits do you hope to see so that you can actually measure it, so you know you're not doing something without measuring the benefit. And the last two, think about who is in your supply chain, who are you currently supplying to, or who is supplying your farm business that's actually walking the talk. And you might hear from a couple of them today. And are they able to help you in your journey? It is in their best interest, both government and the corporate sector, to support you to start building out that data and action list. And who in your circle of influence, who advises you and your business and your industry group to uplift their capability to support you as you uplift yours? So think about the advisors to your business. Are they climate savvy? Can they actually provide advice? And that might be your agronomists, it might be your livestock nutritionists, it might be your banks, it might be your fertiliser rep. They need to know as much as you do to be able to ensure you can have a really good discussion with them about which actions, what are the implications, what does it mean, etc. So I hope that I've left you with that big global picture, an Australian picture, what's happening in Victoria in terms of emissions, but also government programs. The slides you get later will give you a lot more detail. And some signposts for what's to come for part of the agriculture sector and a few ideas on how to kick off or continue your climate action journey. I'm here for the rest of the day and I'm going to look forward to catching up with you at a different time. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. What a wonderful presentation to really set the scene and I think to start stimulating some of those questions about, well, what does this mean for me? So thank you very much. So we all know that Mars Pet Care are an incredibly important part of our agricultural industries and manufacturing industries. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sandy Gain, the Climate and Sustainable Sourcing Lead, Acting Commercial Director from Mars Pet Care, to pick up on the thread around the consumer's preference and how is that driving change. So thank you very much.
Thank you.